you have the federal government money creation big with the Fed and the federal government effectively going to unlimited budget deficit spending, debt expansion. None of that is sustainable. What the Fed is doing with its money supply creation, it's now exponential. We've never seen anything like this.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. We have a first-time guest who is legendary among our viewing audience and has been mentioned countless times by our former guests. We have John Williams from shadowstats.com with us. He's here to break open the truth about what we're not being told about what's going on in our financial lives and economic lives, and kind of strip back the veil of misdirection that we're often presented with on a lot of those key performance indicators of our economic world as well. John, thank you for joining us this first time.
Dunnigan, thank you so much for having me.
We are overjoyed that you were able to make it on the channel, and we've had a few logistical snags along the way, but we finally got you back. People submitted questions up to a month ago anticipating your arrival here, and now the questions have been turning into, when is he going to be on? Are you really do this? Was this really going to happen? So it's happening. Here you are.
I apologize. Those technical problems were on my end, and I'm glad to be on with you now.
No problem at all. Just glad that we have you here. I wanted to mention that our viewers have heard your name probably quoted more often than any other single name. I mean, maybe we've had, Keynes quoted a few times and some others, but those are more infamous. But when our guests come in and they talk about analysis that they've done and what's really happening in our economy and in the economic lives of people and in our financial world and in our individual financial lives, your name comes up more than any other name in reference, and we're just so glad to have you here to kind of dispel some of the fog that gets cast over the truth and to give us a real story. So right off the bat, one of the things that we are concerned about is the risks inherent in our U.S. dollar and I guess fiat currencies in general. And one of the aspects of that people really watch out for is in the risk of inflation and the erosion, the dilution of the currency, the erosion of their savings, of their earnings, of anything that they have that's denominated in dollars. And we're told the official story on, for example, the Consumer Price Index, the CPI by the Fed, that they have an official target of 2% or less for inflation. And we've heard about basically the gymnastics that they've had to do over the years to try to keep changing the measuring stick by which they report that. And also that when people feel in their gut and in their real lives the pinch, whether it's in food prices or medical care or education or housing, that kind of thing, that they're going, okay, I'm supposed to be feeling it only 2% different from last year, but I just saw my medical premiums jump by 20% or whatever. So can you start there perhaps with inflation in general and the currency and the health of the currency and what the real story is that people are feeling and how it's affecting their savings, their earnings, and so on?
Well, the inflation and the health of the currency are closely tied together. The wilder the inflation, the less under control it is. The more rapidly the dollar, when I'm talking now in terms of the U.S. dollar, gets depreciated in terms of its purchasing power. And as I'll be discussing here, the ultimate hedge against actual inflation is physical gold, holding physical gold and silver. But I do most of my work in terms of the gold price over time, tied to inflation and such. But let me back off here, give you a real quick background on myself because it may explain how I got into doing these crazy things like re-estimating inflation and unemployment. I graduated Dartmouth College and the Tuck Business School in '72. Got into a family business that imported chainsaws from West Germany. On the first day on the job was a family business again. Nixon floated the dollar, and that made me a currency trader.
Wow.
And that thing sort of evolved from there. But I did have a degree in economics, and I developed some econometric models, one on the silver market, one on the chainsaw industry, of all things, which I was involved in there. And as time evolved, we had to, the dollar just depreciated, and it was almost like shooting fish in a barrel. You were trying to bet on the currency's direction, which I had to do there. It got to a point that it was just too expensive for us as a importer, where the manufacturer also had a facility in the United States. We were the biggest customer, and we worked a deal, sold all our end of the business to them. We had been the importer. So I looked to make a living as an economist, which I had background in, and what I'd found was something of interest with what they call econometric models, where you can fit mathematically certain variables that should affect what's happening with what's happening, and if you have a lead time there, you can actually forecast into the future. Now, there are some grand-scale econometric models on the U.S. economy, such as which the government use, something like the Wharton model. You have 30,000 variables, and you can forecast almost anything. The only problem is that if you want to forecast where interest rates are going to be next year, what you plug into that model is what the rate of inflation is going to be next year. And if you know what the rate of inflation is going to be next year, you really don't need the model to tell you where interest rates are going. So I hired a mathematical genius who worked with me in developing these models. And what we did was develop models that just used leading indicators, or variables that had a leading relationship, a good leading relationship, so that as they varied, you could expect to see, and a big causal relationship there, you could expect to see things moving forward.
Okay.
So putting that all together, we had a business selling relatively short-term forecasts, but they were accurate. They were based on what already had happened. And then the government started fooling around with its numbers. Now, I built up a fair client base with that. But as the government started fooling around with its numbers, they were no longer being driven by underlying variables. They were being driven by what the government wanted to come out with its reporting. And that caused me to change the whole shape of what I was doing with my forecasting and analysis. And probably the most important one is the one you're getting at, is inflation. And there the changes started back in the early 80s. And to get there, I've got to go back to Richard Nixon, because up through the point of Richard Nixon, even through Roosevelt and making gold legal and to own for Americans in the U.S., up through Nixon, the dollar still was backed by gold, but he abandoned the gold standard. And that was in '71. Once that had happened, all of a sudden you started seeing a little higher inflation, and it started picking up. And into the early '80s, it was beginning to become of concern to the federal government. And what they did was they decided where they had certain things like Social Security, cost of living adjustments, and such that were based on inflation in terms of how they increased it, that if somehow they could reduce the headline inflation, that would actually be a way of helping them cut the budget, even though they were shortchanging the people who were having their incomes or pensions or whatever adjusted for this now artificially reduced cost of living. And I thought that was criminal, and I looked at the changes they made, and started assessing them. And they were very open about what they were doing. But if you knew what they were doing, you could also calculate what it would be had they not done it, or if you just continued on the old basis.
Right.
So what I did was I started my own inflation series called the Shadow Stats. Shadow Stats is my company. That continues to estimate inflation the way it used to be estimated. And over time, a lot of the changes there are cumulative. It's made a difference, order of magnitude of about 7 percentage points above what's being reported as a headline inflation today. Just to give you a quick example as to types of things they did. First big change was in the cost of housing. This was in 1982, and the reason they had to do this was because Nixon had gone off the gold standard. That was giving us the inflation. So if you looked at the cost of housing, that was a major portion of the consumer budget. They looked at what they had there, and one factor in it was the cost of buying a new house. Doesn't seem to be unreasonable. I mean, there were people who were buying new homes, and that was part of the calculations used in structuring the inflation rate. What they did was and that was a big part of it. What they did was they changed that and redefined it and invented their own number called homeowners equivalent rent. And the idea was that they'd try to estimate what a homeowner would rent his house to himself for, which, of course, is an imaginary number. And then the inflation number was based on how much the homeowner would raise the rent on himself each month for living in his own house. Absolute nonsense, but the effect was it knocked 1.4 percentage points off the annual CPI. And there were a number of factors that were changed over time, different concepts that were added, where they put in substitution biases and sum and substance up well up into the 90s. Aggregate net change or net reduction of what you would have had reported otherwise build up to about 7%. Now, that's rather significant. I mean, right now, if you look at the, I think we're down, we're below, the headline CPI is down below 1 percentage point. It's 0.12 was the year-to-year change in May.
Wow.
With my measure, that was 7.7%. Now, that 1.12 is artificially low. That's because of the oil price war and gasoline prices being so low. That's going to pick up again, where that's been averaging in, let's say, the 2%, the 2.5% range. That puts the actual inflation up closer to 10%. That's a big difference. Now, one thing I did here, which I didn't realize what I was doing when I did, but made a very happy discovery, was that when I set my index, when I have a separate index, which is available on my site, and anyone who wants to visit my site, they can just click on the alternate inflation. They can see all sorts of things on it there. But you have a number there that was set equal to the CPI in 1970, which happens to be effectively the same time that Nixon went off the gold standard.
Gold convertibility, yeah.
And the effect is where my index was equal to the CPI at that point in time, and the CPI had basically tracked gold up to that point in time. That's also about the time that the CPI started to move away from tracking gold. So when I plotted my measure against gold, along with the old CPI, I found that, not too coincidentally, that my index level was running pretty close to what the gold level was, because gold was $70 or such at that point in time, and it still is. So if you look at, and this you'll also find on my site, if you look at the price of gold and plot that over time, and if you plot my number against it, my number keeps up with the price of gold, very close. I mean, there at times it varies some, but over the years it tracks very closely. The old CPI used to track, but then it went off course when Nixon abandoned gold, number one, and then as the headline inflation starts to level off against gold, My number, which measures the way it was, continues to rise. My point very simply is that gold is a measure of inflation. It's a measure of real currency. It holds its value over time, the purchasing power over time. You can still buy for the same amount of gold, although it's minuscule, a loaf of bread today, the same amount as would have been needed in ancient Rome. I was in at a monetary conference one time, and this fellow raised a question. He said, my mother keeps complaining that back in the 20s, when she was a girl, she could go to a Broadway play in New York City and get her family get her a third row center seat for $5. And I assured that fellow that if she still had her $5 gold piece, she could still get a third row center seat for a Broadway play.
Yeah, my folks grew up in the Great Depression, and they would go down on Saturdays to watch the matinee for a dime, and a silver dime could probably still get you in.
I think that's about right. Yes. So the point is that the physical metals, particularly the gold at the moment, that's one I've happened to link with inadvertently with my inflation measure, but they explain each other, and it shows that gold does preserve the purchasing power, holding physical gold of the money that you put into it, and that's the most important thing I can tell anyone today, because we're in circumstances now. Where with what's being done to try and get us out of this terrible pandemic crisis in terms of creating, effectively open the floodgates of money creation. Unlimited. You have the federal government, money creation big with the Fed, and the federal government effectively going to unlimited budget deficit spending, debt expansion. None of that is sustainable. What the Fed is doing with its money supply creation, it's now exponential. We've never seen anything like this. If you look at M1, which is the narrowest measure, right now, year over year, that's up 33% or so, and it's moving higher. This is the type of environment that will drive inflation higher, and we have a collapse in the economy driven by the shutdown that came out of the pandemic. You have too much money chasing too few goods, and you're going to see as the goods increasingly we get shortages of goods, that the money there is going to start spiking prices, and it's going to give us an inflation, and eventually it's going to be out of control. And I'm predicting a hyperinflation. And again, the gold will follow the actual purchasing power of the dollar. If the dollar goes hyperinflationary, so will the price of gold. That's been its nature over time.
You've been talking about the tendency towards, you said we're in exponential, we're heading towards what you believe is hyperinflation in the future. What kind of time basis? You mentioned that your expertise your model has primarily been history-based, but it can look somewhat into the future. Does that depend on too many other political and other factors to be able to give us any sense of a timeline?
Well, this is, you've got all sorts of strange things here. In terms of forecasting simple inflation, retail sales, GDP, you've got a forecast horizon of maybe a quarter or so. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what we're seeing here, this goes beyond normal forecasting. This is sort of an end game crisis for the U.S. dollar as we know it. It's the type of thing that I think is already beginning to unfold. And where you can see it, again, it usually takes a little bit of time for something like this to come in. What we're seeing here is really unprecedented from a number of angles. But you have, we've got, we saw something in the last month with both the consumer price index and the producer price index, and this is putting aside the games played with preparing the numbers. With the producer price index, and this is something that's been recreated in the last 20 years or so. But given that limited history, you saw the largest jump ever in the producer price index in May. And what that was driven by was an unprecedented jump of 44% in beef prices, triggered by shortages. Well, you haven't seen too much in the way of shortages now, but there's a fair amount of anecdotal evidence that it's there. This is now what we're seeing from an economic standpoint has been formally defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research as a recession. That's nonsense. This is not a recession. It's not even a depression. It's an economic collapse. And the way the cycle's been defined before, usually it's in terms of an economic cycle, in terms of inventories or flow of income, and you have a natural evolution here. This is really an extraneous factor with the pandemic. I don't think they should call it a recession or even a depression. And there's some basic tradition there. For example, in the past, where you've had a quarterly GDP contraction that was due to a trucker strike, and that's happened. They never called that a recession, but they've called this called us a recession. It's not being driven by normal factors. There's going to be some common features with it, but what we've seen here is an outright economic collapse that's unprecedented. They effectively shut down the economy in March, so that you have at play here something that's going to be extremely disruptive in the next month or two, and it's not going to be good for the market.
Yeah, if you could weigh in on that, because initially, when the common person, people, when they talk about this sudden, like wildfire, it spread across the globe, this shutting down of entire, shutting down of travel, shutting down of many businesses, people being unable to work, huge layoffs happening, and people are thinking, if you bring the entire global economy, by and large, to a standstill, that's going to be hugely disruptive to any measure of any performance measure of the economy, GDP or whatever. And yet the initial numbers we were hearing talked about from the powers that be in government or otherwise were saying 3% or 6% impact or something. That was just, I don't even know why. Maybe you can help us understand, why would anybody even say things like that when everybody knows that most people lives have been majorly disrupted and our commerce majorly disrupted?
Well, I can put it a little bit in perspective, perhaps, and that is how people measure the economy, and this is why this has now been defined as a recession. But if you can't, the way the economy is measured in, let's say, the economic activity in terms of retail sales or production, imports and exports. These are all factors that would normally go into calculating how the economy was doing. So you begin to get the pandemic hits in February, have a little bit of impact there, but really March is when the big shutdown starts. So where the GDP is measured on a quarterly basis, there you have January and February that were going along pretty much as they had been, although they were weakening. March just is a collapse. And so as a result, instead of having the positive 2% GDP growth that they were looking at, you ended up with a 5% decline. That's adjusted for inflation, and that's an annualized quarter-to-quarter rate. And that's what they don't talk about. And again, there are all sorts of things that are done to keep the GDP numbers on the happy side. That's another thing that I look at. And there are things that are done to keep the employment numbers on the happy side, and that's another thing that I look at. They've actually made changes, and I have different estimates. But just looking at the GDP, headline GDP, you're down 5% in the first quarter. You come into the second quarter, you had a big hit in March. You had an even bigger hit in April. Industrial production dropped its largest amount in its 101-year history. Retail sales dropped its largest amount in 73 years of its history. This is Again, not regular economics, but as you measure it as to how the economic measures are going, absolute disaster. Then you have you see big hits as well in the employment, jumps on inflation. You see real strange numbers with those with the employment numbers, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which prepares the numbers, admitted they couldn't actually properly report it because things were misclassified. In April, they had 7.5 million unemployed people that they classified as employed. But because the survey had been done, they don't change the number. And the difference was that the headline unemployment number was 14.7% and should have been 19.5%. That's nonsense. They shouldn't even bother to have reported it. Now they get through May, and all of a sudden they have wonderful improvement, but that's all due to they changed methodologies, they changed seasonal adjustments, and they still couldn't count something like 4.9 million people. They counted them as employed as opposed to being unemployed, where they were unemployed. You're not seeing really good quality reporting there. But even as reported there, you're seeing the employment numbers are down at a annualized quarterly rate coming into the second quarter in the 60% range. Most of the numbers that you look at, and we had retail sales that were down sharply. That's another one that you got some real wild swings in, and now it's not so bad. It almost bounced back in this last week's reporting. All sorts of nonsense in those numbers, but you put them all together, what it looks like is we're going to see a second quarter GDP contraction. This is annualized, quarter to quarter, adjusted for inflation. Order of magnitude 50%. Never had anything like that. You've had Fed Chairman Powell say, "Oh, it's going to be the worst reporting ever." I agree with him. It's just a matter of the magnitude, and even the New York Fed has a model that's showing a 45% contraction. The Atlanta Fed model's down around 30%, which is more along the consensus. But everything I'm looking at saying 50%.
Quick question on that. When you say adjusted for inflation, I imagine not everybody is using the same basis for the inflation that they're using in that adjustment.
No. This is the official headline number. You don't want to put my number up there. But that's the way they report it, as they will report it. Not based on my adjustments that I make to the GDP as to where it really is when you take out certain fudge factors that are in there, including low inflation. Because one benefit, you say, why would they want to understate inflation? Well, aside from that, having to pay out as much in terms of cost of living adjustments, when you're reporting economic data on an inflation-adjusted basis, what they call real growth, the lower the inflation rate you use to deflate the nominal number, the actual headline dollar amount, the stronger the growth is.
Right.
So if you understate the GDP inflation rate by roughly 2 percentage points, which they do, what you'll find, and we're looking at a different concept than the headline CPI, which is more like 7% percentage points. But you look at the GDP, what you'll find is that the headline growth since the Great Recession averaged about 2% a year. So you take out an extra 2% there from understated GDP growth, and effectively we never really recovered from the Great Recession. And a lot of people have experienced that. Others didn't. Others have done well, but there's a lot of thinking that you have to, or a lot of credit you have to give to the average guy. He knows what's happening. He'll listen to the happy press, and it's a problem that you have with the consumer surveys, the common consumer surveys out there. We'll just ask people, how's the economy doing? And the press is saying, oh, the economy's booming along. They'll say it's fine. And then you ask them how they're doing. They say, oh, I'm doing terribly. But guess what? The average guy votes his pocketbook. That's why Donald Trump got elected last time around, and everyone was shocked because the economy wasn't quite as strong as it was being advertised. And it hasn't been for some time. In fact, if you look at, even as reported, industrial production, major part of the economy, manufacturing there, the construction sector, even as reported, those series never recovered their pre-recession levels. So they never recovered from the Great Recession. When I say pre-recession, I'm talking pre-Great Recession. The way they define the business cycle, and it's useful to have that here so you understand what's going on. As the economy rallies, it's gaining. You hit a peak in activity. That peak, then you fall off of that. As you fall off the peak, you recess. That's the recession until you hit a trough. That being the trough. Then as you move off the trough, that's called recovery. You're sort of recovering. And when you regain the pre-recession high, the pre-recession peak, then you're in economic expansion. Well, in the case of industrial production and all the construction measures, you had your peak, your crash to the trough, and some recovery, but you never regained your pre-recession peak. You've never had any economic expansion. That's unprecedented. And in the case of industrial production, we're now into something like 12 years of non-economic expansion. It's the first time in the 101 years of that series that we've ever seen anything like that. The cycle coming into this one was not a normal one. Very unusual times. A lot of that tied to NAFTA and other things. The NAFTA is why I had to change my unemployment number, because they redefined it in 1994 to eliminate people who were long-term discouraged workers.
Right.
I know I'm jumping around here, but I'm going to
No, I was going to ask you about that. So actually, if we can hit two things before you leave the first topic, and then let's get right on into unemployment, because that's next. But before we leave this, the greatest economy ever, you mentioned Donald Trump voters were voting with their pocketbook, and they felt the pinch, and they knew their gut was telling them that the story they were being told wasn't true. But he's been blowing the horn for the so-called strongest economy ever for now the last going on 3 years. And we interviewed a guy from who's at a high level inside the trucking industry back around the end of the year. And the title of the video turned out to be that we put out from that was Economic Red Alert from inside the trucking industry. He said that what he has seen in past economic downturns is that the trucking industry sees a leading economic indicator because they see all kinds of like shipments of component parts starting to drop off before it starts hitting finished goods and things like that. So he said for 14 months they'd been seeing declines, and he said, how do you reconcile that with the strongest economy ever? So first of all, before we leave that topic, you mentioned that when you understate inflation, it allows you to make it look like you have a more robust GDP, because you can take credit for basically any nominal increases in production or whatever and call that growth when it's not really growth. It's just treading water, or worse if it's with CPI. But I'll just ask it flat out, have we in fact seen this quote unquote strongest economy ever? What I'm hearing from you is we never even recovered from the last recession.
Well, let me put it this way, Donald. He's an interesting character. I don't know the man personally, but I can't help but like his bravado and the way he handles some things. This has been a real rough year, and the way all sorts of things have been hitting him. But he's a promoter, and he'll hype the 3.5% lowest unemployment rate ever, and as reported, that's actually was a 50-year low. That was as reported. I would contend that the real unemployment rate, is the way it used to be measured, was significantly higher, and but the way the numbers come out, yes, the economy just booming along, except the average guy wasn't feeling it. And your comment about the trucking industry is absolutely correct. The Cass Freight Index is one of the best measures of economic reality out there. Very good predictor of ups and downs in the economy. It's not seasonally adjusted, but if you look at the year-to-year change in it, it gives you a pretty good indication. And if you look at take a 12-month smooth average of that, that takes out the variability, the seasonality. It's been signaling a downturn here for some time. And in fact, what you've seen, and keep in mind that all these gimmicks that have been put into place, including the inflation, have affected series such as real retail sales, and the industrial production has some other issues. But as headlined, if you look at the fourth quarter of last year, fourth quarter of 2019, and the first quarter of this year, before you had the pandemic, quarter to quarter, retail sales were negative. Quarter to quarter, industrial production was negative. Those are two major sectors of the economy. In that fourth quarter of retail sales, that was a happy holiday shopping season. So you were down quarter to quarter in the fourth quarter, and you're already in downtrend for the first quarter when the pandemic hit. That knocks everything else off the board. It just dominates. Mm-hmm. So you really had a contraction in the fourth quarter. You had one in the first quarter, and had we not had the pandemic, I think we would have been looking at something like a recession number here, which would have been difficult from a political standpoint. But there are all sorts of ways of presenting that, and throwing blame where it should be. Mr. Trump does the best he can with a difficult time and a generally uncooperative Congress.
Oh, no doubt he's got big battles to fight every day and in many different scales at the same time. But what we're talking about isn't unique to one individual. The thing that's the most irksome, I think, to many people is that this whole idea of nominal confusion of trying to get an assessment or a read on whether things are growing or whether they're shrinking or how things are progressing based on, if you're doing that all in terms what's your measuring stick? And if your measuring stick is the currency, and the currency is, you're not being truthful or accurate about how you measure the shrinking or whatever the change of the currency, then it throws off. I mean, it's not possible, is it, to be accurate in any of your numbers?
Well, if you look at the trucking, what you can do is you can look at the physical volume, such as the trucking. That's not in dollar terms.
Right, number of loads, number of tons, containers, miles,
whatever. And there are ways of adjusting the inflation to get a realistic number. But what you had here, and let me get back to even this is now as things are going to be reported. Keep in mind there's maybe a 2% overstatement of the GDP due to their inflation gimmicks on an annual basis.
All right.
Coming in, so we had a 5% contraction in the first quarter, headline. Second, and then this is officially adjusted for inflation. Second, you're going to be down about 50%. That's again annualized, adjusted for inflation, headline inflation. If that happens, what it will do to the level of the real GDP, this is the one that's, again, it's based on artificially low inflation, it will knock off all of the economic growth since the end of the Great Recession. All the economic expansion since the end of the Great Recession will be wiped out. That's the magnitude of what we're about to see. That's what's got Mr. Powell a little scared. And it's not a happy circumstance. There's not much you can do about it at this point. It's not that you can throw cash at the system and people, and it helps to keep people liquid, but it's not going to do much to stimulate the economy. You have to get out of the pandemic. You have to get out of all the pandemic constraints. And there's movement there, but I don't think it's going as well as advertised. As I'm looking at it, and I'm not going to use the term recession or depression because that's really a misnomer. I'm just looking at an economic collapse, but in terms of, I'm putting it in terms, I've given you terms of magnitude as I think it likely will be reported. You are beginning to see a little bit of return in activity, so that, but even so, the second quarter will be down order of magnitude 50%. The third quarter, where you've had the bulk of economic hit in the second quarter, is not going to be down much, if at all, from the second quarter, because you're probably going to come close to hitting bottom in the second quarter. It might be up a little bit. You're going to be bottom bouncing here for a while, and it's as things turn around, and as you come off bottom, of course, you'll have positive growth. I can't tell you how long it's going to take to recover, but it's going to be a long time. It's going to take us more than the 4 years it took us to get out of the depths of the Great Recession.
I think you just answered the question from Dorian Parola, who says the velocity of money has been in free fall for years. When and what will cause a move up? You were just saying you don't see a lot of activity increasing for at least 4 years.
Well, in theory, the velocity of money will drive economic activity, and that is so. But what we're going to see here is inflation that's accompanying that. The real activity is going to stay relatively weak. The nominal activity will tend to soar.
Yeah, so it'll be back to the strongest economy ever, even though we're in hyperinflating. I interrupted you earlier when you were about to talk about unemployment, because that's a lot of people, and the thing again that really burns people that we talk with is, as you mentioned, when things are misstated, when these numbers are not accurate, they're not realistic, and so on. People are basing life decisions, important life decisions. Should I buy a house, or should I just rent a small, modest apartment? Should I move in with family and not buy or rent? Should I purchase a vehicle? Should I move? Should I, people who've been laid off want to know how long am I likely to be able to keep before I can find a job? If they have no idea really how many people are in that unemployment pool that they're competing against because we're being told the wrong thing. So can you talk at least about that aspect of unemployment next, and why
Sure.
the accuracy around that is so important to big decisions in people's lives?
Well, it is. It's one of the older estimates of economic activity. Always been a key concern for people. And as modern economic reporting got underway, at least they're estimating numbers back in the Great Depression and even before. I think in 1929 it was the first hard estimate there. And there have been spots before that, but coming forward, you'd had fairly consistent definitions. Some changes over time, and some new numbers added, but the big shift came in 1994. And what's significant about 1994 is that is when NAFTA was put into place. Now, the way the headline headline unemployment has been calculated has been fairly steady over time. That is, you have you take a survey of people, how many people are employed, how many people are unemployed. You add them together, that's your labor force. Your unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the labor force. There were some changes. They went along and found that, there are other degrees of being unemployed. And there were people, for example, who could only get a part-time job. They wanted a full-time job. You had people who wanted to work. They were looking for work. You have to be counted as unemployed in the numbers today. You have to be actively looking for work, with a couple of caveats. If you're not actively looking for work, then you're not considered in the headline unemployment rate. In the earlier days, they also had something like that, but what they came up with was a classification of a discouraged worker. This is a person who wanted to work, looked for work or had looked for work, but had given up looking for work because there were no jobs to be had. And that was, so you had your discouraged worker. These are people who still stayed current with the jobs market. They wanted to work, weren't able to get jobs. And these are effectively the long-term unemployed, and it was the area that was going to see some increase due to NAFTA and some jobs being shipped offshore. So they redefined the series, and what they did with the redefinition there, the headline unemployment stayed the same. So that what we're seeing today in terms of what they call the U3, the upfront unemployment rate, the one that gets all the headlines, basically defined the same way it was back in the 1960s. But after 1994, the broader measures with different measures of unemployment, particularly the discouraged worker, changed. And what they did was they still counted discouraged workers as long as they had been discouraged for no more than a year. So that you could be discouraged for 12 months, but if after 12 months you wanted a job, but you couldn't find one, there were no jobs to be had, and where you counted as unemployed before, at least as a discouraged worker, they knocked you out of consideration. And going forward, so nobody matured as a discouraged worker beyond a year, and the effect of that was rather significant.
Okay.
The government and its headline, these are the current numbers, as headlined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. These numbers here exclude 4.5 million people. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says were unemployed, but they were counted as employed because they made mistakes in the survey, and they don't correct the survey once the survey's finished. So you can add another 3 percentage points on here. The headline right now is 13.3%. That's our U3. Then they have a number that's called U6, which is 21.2%. Now, what U6 is, it's the U3 definition, which is you're out actively looking for work, you want a job, you can't find one, but you're actively looking. That plus the people who are employed, that gives you your labor force. The U3 has it has a couple of adjustments to it. One is they count the number of people who are working part-time where they want a full-time job, so they're not fully employed.
Mm-hmm.
So they're counted in there as unemployed. They're not fully employed, and they have others that are so-called marginally attached to the labor force, including discouraged workers. But the discouraged workers here are only discouraged for no more than a year.
Okay.
And that one right now is at 22%.
Okay.
Then you have my estimate, which adds back in the longer-term discouraged workers. And I've tracked and estimated that over time. I've had a lot of numbers to work with on it. It's my estimate. The government doesn't publish any numbers that go beyond that at this point, beyond their 22%. But I've been tracking this since before they changed it back in 1994. And my estimate for May was 34%. That actually was 35.4% in April. We had an improvement in the unemployment rate, where all the other numbers that I would use to put in terms of estimation that had worked well in explaining what the unemployment rate actually was. Their headline unemployment rate was in March and April, because in March and April, in March they only counted 1.5 million unemployed as employed. That was March. April they counted 7.5 million people employed or unemployed. And this is per the BLS. They have it in their release. And May was for 4.9 million people who were unemployed but counted as employed. So if you counted it the way it actually was, the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics said it should be, my number came very close to hitting 40% at the end of April, and it's not much below that now. So that there are a lot of people out there who would like a job, but they're the long-term discouraged worker. They're just in an area where there are no jobs to be had.
Two questions about what you just described, because it seems like some of these things are denied symptoms of an illness that was actually caused by the doctor.
Yes.
Just a question, if the part-time workers who wanting full-time, we saw a lot of that happening during the Obama presidency, right after Obamacare became law, where small-time employers, more than 50 employees had to do this, or work more than 30 hours, you had to provide them with. So all of a sudden, number of full-time jobs got split into part-time jobs to kind of as adaptation to avoid this mandate on having to provide coverage to employees. And then secondly, this long-term discouraged, we've seen increasing government dependencies programs where people have lost, in many cases, even culturally, and sometimes for generations, and sometimes regionally in the country, lost the idea of work ethic. People have become so beaten down that my life really, they don't feel that they can make a difference really in their financial future, and so they've settled into this becoming dependent on some kind of subsidy of their life from the government. And would that be another source that's driving this long-term discouraged, really being long-term dependent on the government?
Well, they're not getting unemployment insurance, but yes, in terms of the support programs, you have people there who are certainly receiving some help that wouldn't be if they had jobs.
Yeah, I remember trying to remember the fellow's name. I'll think of it. Richard Llewellyn, I'm trying to think of his name, who said, whatever you tax, you get less of, and whatever you subsidize, you get more of. And it seems like we've subsidized that. There's an altruistic cover story and a conflict of interest on the part of those in power to retain the loyalty of those who are become dependent upon them. So it's a real unhealthy cycle that gets into.
Well, again, in terms of the politicians, all I would do is encourage them to consider that, as was seen in the last election, the last presidential election, the average guy will vote his pocketbook, not what he's hearing in the press. It goes both ways. I mean, if the economy's down and out and the average guy's doing well, he's still going to vote his pocketbook. That's what I refer to as Main Street USA. Main Street USA is very much like industrial production and the construction sector. Most people didn't see the big, heavily advertised economic recovery.
No,
and
right.
That's why you ended up with some of the political turmoil that you had.
Another thing that you mentioned in passing a few minutes ago was NAFTA and how the changing of the way that unemployment was stated or was affected by that. I remember the Ross Perot phenomenon in the presidential election where he said there'd be this sucking sound of jobs leaving the United States and going down south of the Mexican border and so on. We've certainly seen over the 1980s, 1990s, a huge offshoring of work to lower labor cost countries around the world.
Yep.
And now the ultimate of that is automation, to where you don't have any human involved. You hand it over to a robot or whatever. In fact, if people haven't seen it's a 1964 Twilight Zone episode called The Brain Center at Whipple's on the old black and white Twilight Zone, one of the original episodes. It talks about how that progresses if you start replacing everybody with computers. What's the end game for that? But could you talk to us about what you believe is true in the statistics around unemployment and around labor rates, wages, relating to these major dynamics of so-called free trade agreements and globalization of work, as well as automation, and how you see that trending now?
Well, in terms of the unemployment, had we not gone the route of NAFTA and exacerbated thereafter, you'd have a lot more people employed domestically. I mean, the cost there is, I don't have the hard numbers in front of me in terms of the body counts. I could probably come up with it quickly, but you're looking at something like 2.5 times the level of headline unemployment that's reflected there. So say current unemployment plus 1.5. That's a direct result of that. In terms of the wages, I got all sorts of factors that go into that, but consider that the average guys has to face inflation as well, also that when you look at average wages, it's good to consider inflation. And the government puts out a number called the real average weekly earnings. And it's some funny things have been happening with that in the last couple of months tied to the pandemic. But if you adjust it for my inflation numbers, what you'll see is that the current numbers, I mean, you had a plunge, I guess it was into the Great Depression, and it was going down before, and some bouncing a little bit back, but it's still below. It actually is below where it was in real wages, are below where they were in 1973. Whatever you're doing well in 1973, you could. That's about where you are in terms of the headline headline inflation versus the wages. You never really had a great peak here. Now, the funny thing with this, it's not funny, but with the pandemic and the shutdown, what you saw with I guess it was with the April numbers, when you had the big hit to unemployment and payrolls, all of a sudden you had a 5-6% jump in average weekly earnings. The reason for that was that the bulk of the people, or the biggest portion of the people they laid off were those who were at the lowest end of the pay scale. So you knock out all the minimum wage people, and the average earnings jump.
So that gets back to this class disparity, the misfortunes falling harder upon those that are already at struggling at the bottom rungs of the economic strata. That's
what the numbers show.
How about automation? You mentioned these free trade agreements. How about automation? How that's impacting people?
Well, that's been something that's been in the works for a long time. If it's domestically seated, you'll still have people employed to run the machines, or that's a domestic technology factor that tends to balance itself out over time with the people there, and you have a happy evolution if the population evolves along with the underlying economy. The problem is if the underlying economy evolves and it's being fueled by imports from abroad made by foreign labor, then you don't have a good balance with the domestic labor force. And what happens is the domestic labor force becomes unemployed, and you end up with all sorts of bad social programs as we have.
So we have a question here from a viewer, Gone Bamboo, who's concerned about, they're so valuing the truth that you've brought forward and the work that you're doing. They're concerned about how single-threaded we seem to be in this area, that you seem to be, in some ways, a lone warrior. Who else is going to do similar work in case, when John can't continue Shadow Stats?
Well, I have some people that are interested in continuing it. I'm not going to name any names, but there are that there are people who follow it or familiar with it and would like to continue it. I'm always interested in discussing things with people, but I'm not looking to bow out here for some time.
Oh, good.
Hopefully, so it's. But it is my intent that at such time as I do, that there will be some continuity going forward, or I'll just publish. A lot of what I do is published. I mean, people can look at most of the numbers themselves.
We have a question from Jack Robert, who says his question is about inflation's already here for food and agriculture commodities. Are there other areas which are going to rise due to the pandemic, and how long is it going to take to normalize?
Yeah, that's the big question. That's what I was getting at earlier in terms of the shortages. Mm-hmm. You see this supposed surge in retail sales. That's in the context of collapsing production. So presumably inventories are disappearing, mm-hmm. and the production's not picking up. So you're going to have shortages, and this will be in all sorts of goods. What I'd look for, you start to see shortages and you start to see prices rising. Those goods, as the shortages persist, because there's a lot of cash out there, and that's what the money. You get too much money circulating with the shortages, you start to see an unusual spike in inflation. And that can be the basis for your hyperinflation. What I would look for as a signal for a major inflation problem coming, and I do see it coming. I can't give you a precise timing, but I think you'll be seeing a lot higher inflation at a year from now than you have today. And the effect should be foreshadowed by the price of gold. If you start to see a sharp spike in the price of gold, keep an eye open on the on what's happening with the underlying inflation numbers.
That's the next question we had from Martin Como, who asked, what are your thoughts on gold and silver? You've certainly shared already the principle with us that gold holds its level despite the gyrations of the fiat currency. Any further thoughts? You just mentioned now that gold will be a barometer or an indicator of the truth about inflation, even if official statistics don't reveal that truth. Any other thoughts do you have about gold and silver in people's lives?
Well, I do find that gold, indeed, I mean, gold is not an independent animal. It's bought and sold by people who are looking at the real world, and a lot of people who are looking at the real world. And so when you see it moving up against what you'd expect, that I take as I see that it tends to have some leading relationship to my inflation number, and that it is there's some rationale for that, where you have people who are seeing the danger and they're buying the protection. So so when you see this spike in gold, I would take that as, again, a cautionary measure that you may be seeing. You may be about to see a spike in the inflation. In terms of gold per se, I would look at holding the physical metal as opposed to some paper version of it. Mm-hmm. I think what we have ahead of us is really going to turn out to be a hyperinflation. When that happens, you have extraordinary political circumstances. You want to have your gold physically available to you, and that's where you can use it in a barter situation. Same thing with silver. Things like canned goods are also barterable. You mentioned real estate. Real refers to inflation here, and real estate is a good inflation hedge over time. The only problem is that it's not necessarily liquid and portable in a crisis, mm-hmm. which the physical metals are. So that, frankly, I mean, as I view it, the best hedges you have against inflation here, where this can become a real problem, is to hold the physical metal, and you know, I'm not there are many good experts in how best to hold gold. My preference would be to look at holding coins that have been minted by some sovereign source that gives you something that someone's not going to look at a bar and say, "Gee, I wonder if that's 0.99, 0.99 or what."
The purity, right?
If you have a British sovereign or a $20 gold piece, that would be accepted at face. What you need to consider here is that you may be in a very difficult economic, probably political circumstance. It's a backstop for many things that can go wrong, and but you don't have to put all your assets in it. But as long as you've got more than the average guy, you're in good shape.
We have another question. This is the last one I believe we'll have time for. It leverages something you mentioned a little while ago about the potential ineffectiveness, depending on the circumstances, of a central bank trying to inject additional liquidity or currency into the system to try to stimulate activity. Anna Krzyzelinsky asks, John, by how many months or years can the money printing, the expansion of the currency supply, prolong the life of the worldwide financial system?
Not long. I had one person. I'm going to be writing about this in the next week or two. One person, with what I've been writing, said, "Why would the, if they're doing things here that are so obviously going to lead to a hyperinflation, why would they do it?" Mm-hmm. I don't think they have any choice in the matter. They're just buying time, and as such, I don't think they can buy that much time. They'll buy, I'm sure, more time than I think they have again, and just watch the price of gold. But once they've done the things that they've done here, and they said they're unlimited in terms of how much money they're going to print.
Currency.
Consider,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when this crisis started, they removed all reserve requirements for banks. Now, the banks had reserve requirements because they have loans out, and you have someone go under, and you need to have some reserve to cover that to make sure that you're okay. The Fed's saying, no, you don't worry about it. We'll take care of you. And they'll print whatever money they have to do it. They're just trying to keep the system afloat. And if what you'll see me writing about, and what I have also mentioned before, is that with a very good analyses by Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, consistent analyses, stories. Yes, we can create inflation anytime we want by printing money. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're creating inflation. But they have no way. They have no other way out of it. They having the system collapse financially is worse to them than having an inflationary collapse somewhere down the road. They're buying time.
That's fairly sobering for those of us who are trying to figure out our path forward. It sounds like your advice to people is to have storable food, have more than the average guy of physical gold and silver in your own possession. There was one more question that if you wanted to take a crack at it, that'd be fine. If you don't have time, that's fine as well. And that is, you've been given a genie's lamp. This is from Yes Quiet, who says, John, you found a genie's lamp, and you have 3 wishes to best restore the United States to honesty, honor, decency, and goodwill, top to bottom, throughout the land. And your wishes are?
Well, I could make that would be my wish, and let the universal powers that be figure that one out. There's no easy cure at this point. Let me put it this way: the process that might have put us in a better shape here, there's some movement towards in terms of moving away from the globalism, offshoring our economy and our jobs, bringing that back. That's the type of thing that that doesn't turn around overnight, but it's over a decade or so, and good policies could turn things around. I don't think we have that time now. What the crisis has done is it's upended the system, and I wish I could say otherwise. And believe me, I'm not making any guarantees here. I just don't see a way of avoiding a hyperinflation crisis here that. Which on top of economic collapse is going to be, if we were using the terms that they usually use on the economy, something like a hyperinflation or a Great Depression. Depression used to be thought of as maybe 10%. Great Depression would be more than 25% in terms of the contraction. We're going to see one quarterly contraction here of 50%. That it'll only be down about 15% year to year, which would qualify as a depression, and then you're going to be bouncing along. So it's really hard to define it. It's an extraordinary circumstance. It's not a normal economic cycle, and things will recover, but it's going to be slower than I think most people are hoping for. And if you can keep yourself liquid and solvent through that time frame, just be careful, conservative. Have a stock of goods that don't lose value with a time or inflation.
Mm-hmm.
Use common sense.
Wise words, John. Thank you so much. We've been speaking with John Williams, the founder and owner of shadowstats.com. He is joining us this first time ever on Liberty and Finance and Reluctant Preppers. John, just thank you so much for joining us, and look forward to having you back in the future.
Well, thank you, Duncan, and really appreciate being on your show, and I appreciate the questions from your audience. You have a good audience, sir.
Excellent. Thank you, John. If you've decided that now is the right time for you to protect your family's financial future by acquiring physical precious metals, gold and silver, I'm delighted to let you know that I have now become a licensed dealer's representative for Miles Franklin, one of the oldest and most trusted names in bullion dealerships. And we can provide you with physical delivery to your personal possession or to professional vault storage or precious metals IRAs. Just email me at libertyandfinance@protonmail.com, and please include your name and phone number in your email to libertyandfinance@protonmail.com. We'll get right back with you and find out how to best meet your needs so that you can either begin or increase your acquisition of physical precious metals now and protect your family's future starting today.